I'd like to know your thoughts on the HBO series Rome. Accurate? Sensational? Lots of people wanted to know about the historical accuracy of all the various portrayals of Rome on TV and in the movies. Gladiator, Spartacus, I, Claudius, HBO's Rome, and the new Spartacus series. I'll start right off by saying that I'm not really a big stickler for details when it comes to these things. I can and do separate the fictional reality from the historical reality. Did Livia poison everyone who got in her way? Probably not. Was there ever a Spanish general named Maximus who became a gladiator, killed Commodus, and restored the Republic? Of course not. Was everyone in ancient Rome as handsome and clean as the original Spartacus would have us believe? Definitely not. But none of that stuff really bothers me too much. It's all fantasy, and should be taken as such. I'll admit to being on guard a lot more for the HBO series than I have been for others, because they seem to be explicitly portraying major historical events that we know a lot about, unlike, say, Spartacus, about whom we know almost nothing. I thought Rome was excellent in places, and historically speaking, about as accurate as the format allows. Key characters were omitted, sure, battles like Dyrrhachium were skipped completely, and the whole second season compressed the timeline radically because the show was slated for cancellation. But history is really long and really complicated, and when you fictionalize it, you do have to streamline things a bit, which I fully understand and sympathize with. They did a bang-up job, though, immersing me in the period, and by all accounts, the costumes, uniforms, and architecture were all spot on. My only real complaints about Rome is that I found Lucius Vorenus thoroughly detestable as a character, even though I was supposed to like him, and a few of Titus Polo's storylines were just terribly written. But that has nothing to do with accuracy or authenticity, it was just bad writing. I have the same problem with Spartacus Blood and Sand, the new ultra-violent sexploitation show on Starz, also available to stream on Netflix. I don't mind that it takes all the most sensationalist rumors about ancient Rome and cranks them up to 11. That's all in good fun. But the character of Spartacus is just developing in a way that leaves me really doubting his ability to lead the greatest slave uprising in Roman history. One in which, through a mix of personal charisma, strategic brilliance, and tactical know-how, he keeps the cream of the Roman legions on the ropes for 2 years. The Spartacus we get here is selfish, weak, and about as strategically minded as a water buffalo in heat. I have hopes that the writers will let him grow up a bit, but if not, I think they ought to crucify him and write an alternative history where Doctore leads the Great Slave Uprising. That I would not only watch, but would believe. For those of you who are curious, though, in my opinion, the most historically accurate movie set in Rome has to be the little-known 1964 classic, Rome vs. Rome, starring John Drew Barrymore. They should show this movie in schools as a documentary. I'm totally 100% serious about this. Mal says, my question is, what do you plan to do after the history of Rome? Are there other periods or civilizations that also have your interest? Well, right now I'm convinced that the history of Rome will never end, so I don't really have to think about it. But seriously, I am as passionate about American history as I am about Roman history, and have had for a while now a particular project in mind that documents the life cycle of each of the so far 6, I think 6 anyway, distinct political party systems that have defined American history. You know, first the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, then the Jacksonian Democrats versus the Whigs, then the Republicans versus the Reconstructed Democrats, and so on. It winds up being a really great window into the larger cultural and economic history of the country, and I'm really looking forward to turning it into something, someday. 16-year-old Giants fangirl writes, Hi, being a huge baseball fan, here is a baseball question. Who do you think should retire Randy Johnson's number? I know you are a huge fan of him, as am I, and am curious. Though he pitched with and made his name with the Diamondbacks, he was not too happy with them for not signing him this last season. So, should the Giants retire his number instead? First of all, I would like to gently remind those too young to remember that Randy Johnson made his name with the Seattle Mariners, not the Arizona Diamondbacks. His years in Arizona were brilliant, of course, but it was with Seattle that he first established himself as one of the greatest left-handed pitchers of all time. My answer then would normally be that both the Mariners and Diamondbacks ought to retire his number, as there is nothing wrong with two teams honoring a player they both shared. However, things are complicated a bit because Randy's number 51 is currently being sported by future Hall of Famer and possible minor deity Ichiro Suzuki. So my final answer is that the Diamondbacks ought to retire his number, and the Mariners ought to just issue it to every player on the team, since clearly it has magical properties. A. Fisher submits, I think the only time that archers were ever mentioned in any of the episodes is when the Romans were fighting the mounted archers of the Numidian cavalry. The maps of battles also contained the infantry and the cavalry, but never the archers. It always seemed to be a serious tactical mistake. Did the Romans simply not employ them? Were their tactics not compatible with archers? Or were archers included with either the cavalry or the infantry, but not as a separate unit? The Romans did use archers, but they were almost always foreign auxiliary units brought in from the east. Whether on foot or mounted, they would have generally been used at the beginning of a battle to create chaos within the enemy ranks and dampen an opponent's morale. The Romans also employed slingers to accomplish the same goal. But it was all about softening up the other line for a good old heavy infantry attack, rather than as a primary offensive weapon, as with, say, the Parthians and, most famously, the Mongols. Whether this was a tactical error is debatable, as the record of the legions pretty much speaks for itself. When did Latin officially die as a language? Do we have any record of who the last native speaker of Latin was? Well, Latin never really died, it just went underground. At some point around the 9th century, Vulgar Latin, which had become the predominant spoken language for most of the lower-class citizens of the now-fallen empire, began to splinter into the various Romance languages we know today: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, etc. Latin in its written form, meanwhile, survived this oral transition in the pages of the Catholic Church and the law books of the various European kingdoms, though its unmooring from a spoken counterpoint has rendered it a very different animal than the Romans knew. So I think the answer is basically, Latin was dead by the time of Charlemagne. But if you look around, you'll notice that Latin continues to surround us today. Nick asks, time is of course an illusion, but I think it might be interesting to investigate the Roman calendar and clock, which I understand had variable hours which appear on Prague's famous clock. I'm glad this was asked because it was something that I wanted to talk about during A Day in the Life, but the narrative thread just never gave me a good opportunity to stick it in there. For most of the early Republic, the day was divided roughly into before noon and afternoon. The Romans did not adopt accurate sundials and water clocks until the 2nd century BC, and even then, they were more of a novelty or decorative piece than anything else. In essence, the Romans were just not locked into minutes and hours the way that we are. Punctuality was never stressed, and except for the large markers like sunrise, noon, and sunset, they paid very little attention to what quote-unquote time it was. In the first few centuries AD, this began to change somewhat as accurate Greek timepieces began to be adopted in a much more serious manner. At that point, people did begin to pay more attention to the division of hours that had been named and assigned way back when sundials first began to appear around the time of the Punic Wars. The Roman day was divided as hours into 24 hours, 12 daytime and 12 nighttime. But the fascinating thing is that, because of the shifting seasons, Roman hours were forever variable. The Roman hour was not a set 60 minutes. It was instead simply 1/12 of however long the day was. This meant that during the winter solstice, a Roman daylight hour was only 45 minutes long, while during the summer solstice, it was extended to 1 hour and 15 minutes. So over the course of the year, there was a 30-minute swing in how long an hour actually was. And you think daylight savings time is weird. My understanding is that the clock in Prague uses a variation of Italian hours, where the first hour begins whenever the sun sets, and the 24th hour immediately precedes the next sunset. Obviously, this means that as with Roman hours, when, say, the 7th hour or the 19th hour starts and ends varies with the season. But the Roman system was all about fluctuating lengths of time, rather than changing start times. Finally, Detlef asks, if you were to start all over again with the experience you have today, what would you do differently? not including correcting minor mistakes and fixing minor glitches. I have one answer to this question that revolves around the narrative, and another that is a technical point that would have done a lot to resolve the minor mistakes. To take the latter first, I would have given myself a much firmer grounding in Latin before I got started, so that I wasn't constantly undermining myself with butchered pronunciation. As to the former, I think as we shifted from the Republic to the Empire, the show really did begin to focus too intently on the emperors at the expense of other worthy topics. I can mount a pretty good defense of why I chose to go in the direction I did, but mostly, I'm just going to try to do a better job in the future, making sure the history of Rome is the history of Rome, not the history of the Roman emperors. Well, okay, I think I've crammed in about as much as I can. There are tons of questions that I wanted to get to, but simply did not have the time to cover. If your question didn't get answered, don't despair. I read every comment that came in and have them all banked away in my History of Rome folder, and plan to dip into them from time to time as we continue along our way. At a minimum, all the great feedback let me know what kinds of things you all are interested in. So, even if I don't do another big question blowout, if I can find a way to steer the narrative in a way that will let me cover things people asked about, I'm totally going to do it. Next week, though, we're back to basics, to cover the transition from Antoninus Pius to Marcus Aurelius, the man who shows up on many top 5 emperors lists, and Lucius Verus, a man who, if he's not careful, could very well find himself appearing on a list of the worst emperors of all time. Yep, good old acoustic picking 18. Love it. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 91, Marcus and Lucius and the Parthians. From very early on, everyone knew that Marcus Aurelius was going to be emperor someday. Born Marcus Aeneas Verus, the future emperor displayed from a young age the serious and scholarly temperament that first recommended him to Hadrian and then cemented his reputation as Rome's great philosopher-emperor. But of course, for the first 8 years of his reign, Marcus did not rule alone. For the first time in history, at Marcus's insistence no less, there were actually 2 emperors ruling Rome at the same time. From very early on, no one knew what was going to become of Lucius Verus. Born Lucius Caeonius Commodus, the future emperor displayed from a young age the self-indulgent and fun-loving temperament that first led Antoninus and the Senate to dismiss him, and then cemented his reputation as one of Rome's great hedonist emperors. The unlikely partnership between Marcus and Lucius, which Lucius managed to not screw up too badly, would prove to be a watershed moment in the development of the always evolving imperial political apparatus, and in less than a century, multiple emperors would become the rule rather than the exception. Marcus's family, like the families of Hadrian and Trajan before him, originated in Roman Spain, and though they had only risen to prominence the century before, by the time Marcus was born in 121, his family was rich and powerful, connected closely to the imperial court, and living fat off the brickworks they owned, which Hadrian had used to build his architectural empire. The grandson of one of Hadrian's closest friends, Marcus was only 6 when Hadrian ordered the boys enrollment in the equestrian order, and only 7 when Hadrian appointed him to an ancient and exclusive priesthood for young men, even though Marcus, due to his age